The sharp crackle of static shattered the stillness in the deep space monitoring station. Captain Orion Vex froze, his pen clattering to the desk. Across the room, screens flashed red, their warning lights painting the walls in jagged streaks of crimson. "What is that?" he barked, rising from his chair. Eric Sarn, a lean technician with a nervous twitch, glanced up from his console. His fingers danced over the keyboard, trying to keep up with the incoming chaos. "Wideband distress call, sir. Non-terrestrial. It's encrypted." "Play it," Orion ordered. He stepped closer, his boots tapping against the metal floor. The room's usual hum of quiet chatter had vanished. All eyes were on the console. The static faded, replaced by a desperate, alien voice. The words came through jagged, fragmented, and heavy with fear. "This is the Helorian Council. Haven is under attack. Brutal force, no mercy. Civilians, we beg for assistance." The message looped, growing sharper with each repetition. Orion's stomach tightened. Helorians, an advanced and reclusive species pleading for help. That alone was unheard of. "Trace it," he said, his tone flat but cold. "Find the source. I want full coordinates and a situation report in 5 minutes." Sarn nodded, his face pale under the flickering lights. "It's coming from deep in Helorian space. There's interference. Something's trying to block it." "Sabotage?" Orion's jaw clenched. "Someone doesn't want us to hear this." Behind him, Tobias Quinn, the station's senior analyst, adjusted his glasses. "Sir, we don't know what's out there. Jumping into this could pull us into a war." Orion didn't turn. His focus stayed on the transmission, repeating like a heartbeat. "Helorians don't ask for help. If they're calling us, they're desperate." Quinn hesitated, but Sarn spoke up. "I've got the signal's location. It's stable, but the data's incomplete. Whatever hit them wasn't small." Orion stared at the map now projected on the central screen. The coordinates glowed like a beacon surrounded by debris clusters and heat signatures. His mind raced. A species as advanced as the Helorians shouldn't have been overwhelmed. Not like this. "Send the data to command," he said sharply. "And get Fleet Command on the line. We need a full council briefing." Sarn hesitated. "Do you think it's a trap?" Orion exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing on him. "Trap or not, they're dying out there. We're going to find out why." The static from the transmission filled the room again, stark and raw. Orion turned, his eyes narrowing as he spoke to no one in particular. "Whoever started this doesn't know what they've unleashed." The command room's doors slid open with a low hiss as Orion Vex strode inside. The smell of recycled air hung faintly, mixed with the metallic tang of electronics under strain. The chatter of the Earth Defense Council filled the chamber, a low hum of tension as holographic displays flickered over the massive central table. Orion's boots hit the floor with a deliberate rhythm, cutting through the dissonance. "Captain Vex, your presence is overdue," barked General Kovar, his sharp gaze darting over Orion. The older man's silvered hair caught the cool glow of the holograms, his uniform immaculate, his tone edged with impatience. "Helorian distress signal," Orion said, his voice steady but firm. He placed a data chip on the table. "Details are incomplete, but it's bad. They're under attack by something brutal. Civilians are being targeted. The interference was intentional." The room fell silent, except for the soft whir of the holotable as the star map materialized. The coordinates of the Helorian system pulsed ominously. Orbital scans flickered on the display, revealing massive debris fields and unnatural heat blooms. "They're too advanced for this," murmured Admiral Derek, a wiry man with narrow eyes. "Helorians built entire star bases with defenses even we couldn't breach." "Not anymore," Orion replied, his eyes narrowing. "Whatever's hitting them has turned those defenses to ash." Kovar leaned forward, his voice low but commanding. "You're suggesting intervention? Earth can't afford to stretch its forces thin for a species that has ignored us for decades." "Not just suggesting," Orion shot back, his tone like steel. "I'm saying it's necessary. If this enemy can tear through Helorian defenses, what happens when they're done with them? Do we wait for them to knock on Earth's door?" A low murmur rippled through the council. Kovar's jaw tightened. his fingers drumming on the table. Orion let the silence linger, his gaze sweeping the room. He could feel the weight of their hesitation, the pull between caution and duty. Tobias Quinn's voice broke the silence. "Captain, what exactly is the strategy here? Helorian tech is leagues ahead of ours. Their destroyers make our fleet look like fishing boats. How do we even approach this?" Orion's lips pressed into a thin line. "They rely on perfect systems, everything optimized, predictable. That's their strength and their flaw. We've survived chaos. We adapt. That's what we'll use." Admiral Derrick raised an eyebrow. "And the Harbingers? If they've taken down Helorians, what makes you think we'll fare better?" "They've never fought Deathworlders," Orion said simply, his tone dark. "Helorian intel says they avoid unpredictable threats. We are the threat they've avoided." Kovar's fist came down on the table, rattling the holoprojector. "Enough! A vote. Do we send forces or stand down?" The council cast their votes, each one sealing Earth's path. When the last hand rose, Kovar exhaled through his nose, displeasure clear. "The vote is in favor," he said, his voice tight. "Captain Vex, assemble your fleet. You've just bought us a war." Orion stepped back, his jaw set, the scent of tension and ozone heavy in the air. "Let's show them why that was a mistake." The docking bay of Earth's flagship, Ironclad, buzzed with controlled chaos. Men shouted over the whine of power tools, sparks dancing like fireflies as engineers sealed the final armor plates. The air was thick with the tang of heated metal and the sting of fuel vapors. Orion Vex stood near the command lift, his gaze fixed on the rows of starships lining the hangar, their hulls gleaming like predatory beasts ready to strike. "Fleet's nearly prepped, Captain," said Tobias Quinn, joining him. The analyst clutched a data pad, his voice quieter than usual, as though the enormity of the task weighed on him. 16 destroyers, 10 escorts, and 2 carriers. It's everything we've got." Orion nodded, his face carved from stone. "And the crew?" Quinn adjusted his glasses, avoiding Orion's piercing eyes. "They're ready. Nervous, but ready." "They should be," Orion replied, his voice like gravel. "This isn't just another mission. It's a statement." He stepped onto the lift as the platform whirred to life, carrying him toward the Ironclad's bridge. The bay floor fell away beneath him, revealing the vessel's sprawling expanse, its armored hull etched with deep scars from battles long past. Every dent and scratch told a story of survival, a history of defying impossible odds. As the lift settled, Orion stepped onto the bridge. The space hummed with quiet precision, the crew immersed in their stations. Displays projected shifting star maps, and the subdued light turned the room into a theater of shadows and flickers. "Tactical update," Orion said as he approached the central console. Lieutenant Eric Sarn glanced up from his station, his fingers flying over the controls. "Coordinates locked, sir. Helorian system is 3 jumps out. We'll hit the first jump gate in 8 hours. "Status of the fleet?" Orion asked, scanning the data streaming across the holographic table. Sarn's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "All ships operational, though some of the escorts are running old shield arrays. They'll be vulnerable if we encounter serious resistance." "We'll compensate," Orion said, his tone unwavering. "They're not expecting us, and that's our edge. Helorian space isn't just a battlefield. It's their graveyard. We adapt, and we make it theirs." Sarn's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Understood, sir." The bridge fell silent for a moment as the crew absorbed the gravity of the situation. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of consoles, a stark reminder of the fragile calm before the storm. Orion paced to the viewport, his eyes fixed on the shimmering vastness of space. It loomed like an endless predator, beautiful but indifferent. Quinn stepped closer, his voice low. "You think we're ready for this? Against whatever tore through them?" "No one's ever ready," Orion said without turning. "But we've lived through things that would break them. They don't know what we are yet, Tobias. They will." The first jump gate loomed ahead, its glowing ring pulsing like the heartbeat of an ancient beast. Orion's hand tightened on the railing as he issued the command. "Engage! Take us to war!" The ironclad surged through the jump gate, its shimmering light consuming the bridge in a cascade of blues and silvers. The air felt charged, thick with an almost magnetic pull as space folded around them. Orion Vex gripped the command rail, his gaze locked on the swirling energy ahead. The ship lurched, and then the distortion peeled away, leaving the vast expanse of Helorian space sprawling before them. It wasn't as he expected. The first impression wasn't devastation. It was silence. The void stretched out, stars twinkling faintly like distant, disinterested spectators. But then the scanner feeds came alive, and the quiet turned menacing. "Captain, I've got debris fields everywhere," Sarn said, his voice taut. He enlarged the holographic display, and jagged fragments of shattered ships filled the screen. They floated lifelessly, like the bones of a great leviathan picked clean by predators. "Those aren't just Helorian ships. Some of this tech looks mixed." Orion frowned. "Mixed how?" "Harbinger components," Sarn replied, swallowing. "But spliced with something else. We don't have a match." Orion leaned closer, his eyes narrowing at the screen. The fragments seemed unnatural, almost alive in how their edges glinted, reflecting the dim starlight like a predator's teeth. "Send out a probe. Passive scan only. I don't want to wake anything." The probe's launch was a whisper, and within seconds, its data began to feed back. Lieutenant Quinn approached with a hard look, his usual caution laced with unease. "This isn't just an attack," he said quietly. "It's a dismantling. Those ships weren't destroyed in combat. They were harvested." The word hung in the air, heavy and cold. Orion felt it settle in his chest, sharp and unyielding. He turned back to the viewport, the stillness outside suddenly feeling oppressive. "What kind of enemy leaves wreckage like that but no survivors?" "Captain," Sarn interrupted, his tone clipped, "we've got something. 30 clicks out. It's faint, but there's movement." "Bring it up," Orion ordered. The main display flickered, revealing a cluster of shapes moving in eerie synchronicity. Harbinger ships. Their hulls gleamed unnaturally, black and seamless as if carved from shadow. They drifted between the debris, deliberate yet methodical. "They're searching," Orion murmured, his voice low. "Not patrolling. Hunting." A murmur ran through the bridge, but Orion's voice cut through it like a blade. "All hands, silent running. I don't want so much as a power fluctuation. Sarn, get me a closer look without giving away our position." The tension on the bridge was palpable, the crew moving with hushed efficiency. The display zoomed in, and for the first time, they saw it. A Helorian escape pod, battered but intact, hidden among the wreckage. "They missed it," Quinn whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Survivors." "Not for long," Orion replied grimly. "Their net's closing. We have to move." "What's the plan, Captain?" Sarn asked, his hands poised over the controls. Orion's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "We're going to bait them, draw their attention, and make them believe we're the bigger threat. If they want hunters, we'll give them a predator they'll never forget." The ironclad shifted into position, its silhouette vanishing against the star-specked void. Orion stood at the center of the bridge, his voice steady but taut. "Deploy decoy drones. Give them something to bite." Lieutenant Sarn moved swiftly, his hands gliding over the controls. The drones slipped from their bays, each one disguised as a struggling escape pod, their flickering signals mimicking distress calls. On the main display, the Harbinger ships paused, their predatory formation tightening as they adjusted course. "They're taking the bait," Quinn muttered, leaning closer to his terminal. His usual stoic expression had cracked, tension pulling at his features. "They're not just moving, they're converging." Orion's jaw set. Exactly as planned. The decoys pulsed brighter on the scanner, their signals erratic, painting a picture of desperation. The Harbinger ships, now fully committed, moved in smooth, calculated arcs. Their silence was unnerving. No broadcasts, no scanning waves, just cold precision as they closed in on the fake targets. "Distance?" Orion asked, his gaze locked on the display. 5 clicks and closing fast, Sarn replied. If they detect the deception, they won't, Orion cut in, his tone sharp. They've never had to second-guess prey. That's their weakness. The bridge was silent except for the faint beep of scanners and the muted rustle of shifting uniforms. Every second stretched, the air heavy with anticipation. Orion could feel it, a predatory stillness like the moment before a storm broke. He turned to Quinn. Status on the real pod? Still hidden, Quinn said, tapping his screen. But not for long. If those ships sweep closer, they'll find it. Orion's gaze flicked to the viewport, where the Harbingers loomed like shadows come to life. Not if we strike first. The ship's tactical officer, Mullick Drayden, glanced up from his station, his voice calm but firm. They're in range, Captain. Orion nodded. Engage the disruptors, scramble their comms, but keep our systems dark. I want them confused, not alert. The ironclad released a pulse, silent and invisible to the naked eye, but its effect was immediate. The Harbinger ships faltered, their tight formation unraveling as their sensors flickered. On the display, their movements grew erratic, like a predator suddenly unsure of its prey. Now, Orion commanded, bring us in. Maximum thrust. The ironclad surged forward, slicing through the debris field like a knife through water. The Harbingers spun to react, but the disruptors kept them sluggish. The ship's hull trembled faintly under the strain, the vibrations running through Orion's boots as the ship weaved between wreckage and broken stars. They're shifting focus, Sarn said, his voice rising. 2 ships breaking off, heading for us. Orion's lips curled into a grim smile. Good. Keep them chasing shadows. As the ironclad neared the escape pod, its battered frame became clearer. Scorch marks marred the metal, and faint flickers of light blinked from within. Quinn exhaled softly. There's someone alive in there. Orion's voice was steady but edged with urgency. Get it on board. We're not leaving anyone behind. The Harbingers loomed closer, their sleek forms cutting through the wreckage like silent predators. The bridge crew braced, but Orion's focus was unshaken. They think we're prey, he murmured. Let's teach them what happens when they're wrong. The escape pod clamped into the docking bay with a harsh metallic scrape, the vibrations rippling through the deck. Orion moved swiftly, the tension in his shoulders coiling tighter with every step. Behind him, Quinn and Sarn kept pace, their faces pale under the flickering bay lights. The air carried a faint bite of coolant and burnt wiring as the atmosphere stabilized. Pressure seal confirmed, Quinn said, his voice clipped. Pod integrity holding, but the life support system is barely functional. Orion's gaze locked onto the pod's surface. The metal was scorched, its edges warped as if clawed by something far beyond conventional weaponry. The translucent viewport, clouded with soot, gave no hint of who or what was inside. Open it, Orion ordered. A technician stepped forward, fingers gliding over the control panel. The hiss of decompressing air filled the bay, sharp and sudden, cutting through the oppressive quiet. The pod's hatch creaked open, and a figure slumped forward, catching the dim overhead light. Medic! Orion barked. The crewman was Helorian, his pale blue skin dulled to an ashen hue. He gasped, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. His limbs trembled, his frail frame a stark contrast to the stories of Helorian strength and grace. Orion crouched, his gloved hand resting lightly on the alien's shoulder. You're safe now, Orion said, his tone low but firm. Who did this to you? The Helorian's eyes fluttered open, their inky black depths shimmering faintly. He rasped something in his native tongue, a sound like brittle leaves crushed underfoot. Sarn stepped closer, his translation device whirring softly. Harbingers, Sarn relayed, his voice taut. He says, they're not what they seem. They use, he faltered, glancing at Orion, others to fight for them. Orion's jaw tightened, his mind racing. Others? Who? The Helorian coughed violently, a wet, grating sound. His fingers gripped Orion's sleeve, his strength waning but his desperation cutting through. He muttered another phrase, the words fragmented. He says, they're built for war, Sarn translated, his voice dropping. They make slaves of worlds. Before Orion could respond, the ship jolted, the deck shuddering beneath their feet. The alert lights flashed crimson, painting the bay in a pulsing glow. Over the comm, Drayden's voice rang out, tense and sharp. "Captain, Harbinger ships are closing fast. We've been marked." Orion rose, his focus shifting instantly. "Seal the pod and secure him. We're leaving this sector. Now." Quinn stepped forward, his brows furrowed. "If they're following us, they'll lead us straight to the rest of their fleet." "Exactly," Orion replied, already striding toward the bridge. His voice carried like a blade, cutting through hesitation. "We'll drag them in. Let them think they're chasing us." The ship groaned as the thrusters roared to life, the vibrations thrumming through the hull like a pulse. Orion entered the bridge, the tension crackling like static in the air, his gaze fixed on the viewport, where the Harbinger ships loomed like shadows stalking the light. "They want to hunt?" Orion said, his voice hard. "Then we'll give them one they'll never forget." The ironclad surged through the debris field, its thrusters carving through the void with precision. Harbinger ships followed in predatory silence, their sleek forms cutting through space like knives. Orion Vex stood at the bridge's command station, his gaze locked on the display. The enemy was closing, their intent clear. "Drayden," Orion called, his tone sharp. "How long until they're in range?" 30 seconds, Drayden replied, his hands steady over the tactical console. "Their formation is tightening. They're treating us like prey." "Good," Orion muttered, his lips curving into a grim smile. "Deploy decoys. Spread them thin and wide." Sarn worked quickly, releasing drones that scattered into the wreckage. Each emitted faint energy signatures, mimicking damaged escape pods or crippled ships. On the display, the Harbinger formation faltered, their precision dulled as they diverted to investigate. "They're biting," Quinn observed, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "They've got the tech, but they're too cautious. They're not used to traps." "They've never needed to be," Orion said, his tone cutting. "We'll make sure they learn." Outside the viewport, the void was alive with movement. The Harbinger ships darted toward the decoys, their energy pulses slicing through the darkness. One by one, the drones exploded, bursts of simulated distress scattering debris across their path. Orion turned to Sarn. "Status on the real pod?" "Still secure," Sarn confirmed, his hands moving with practiced ease. "We're drawing them farther away." The bridge was tense, the crew moving in tight coordination. The air felt charged, the faint vibrations of the ship's movements thrumming through the deck. Orion's mind churned, calculating the next step as his eyes darted between displays. "They're starting to regroup," Drayden warned. "They've realized the decoys are fake." "Not fast enough," Orion said. He stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Drayden, prepare the gravitic destabilizer. Target the densest wreckage field ahead." Quinn's head snapped up. "You're going to use the debris as a weapon?" "Exactly," Orion said, his tone sharp. "They rely on clean maneuvers, precision strikes. Let's see how they handle chaos." The ironclad veered sharply, its thrusters blazing as it led the Harbingers toward the densest section of the debris field. The ship groaned under the strain, the hull vibrating faintly as it threaded through twisted fragments of wreckage. "Drayden, now!" Orion barked. A pulse erupted from the ironclad, invisible but immediate. The debris field shuddered as fragments of destroyed ships accelerated, spiraling toward the Harbinger vessels like shards of glass in a hurricane. The enemy ships faltered, their shields flaring brightly as they struggled to adapt. "Direct hits on multiple targets," Drayden reported, his voice tight with focus. "2 ships disabled. The rest are scattering." Orion exhaled, his focus unwavering. "Press the advantage. Keep them off balance." As the ironclad surged forward, leaving chaos in its wake, Orion's thoughts turned to the Helorians' cryptic warning. The Harbingers weren't what they seemed, and this was only the beginning. Whatever truth lay ahead, he was determined to uncover it, before it was too late. The ironclad darted through the shifting wreckage, each fragment spinning wildly in the artificial storm they'd unleashed. On the bridge, Orion's voice carried over the tension. "Adjust course. Keep them guessing." Drayden's fingers moved deftly over his console. Trajectory recalibrated. Their remaining ships are scattered but regrouping fast. Orion's gaze fixed on the tactical display. The Harbingers were adapting, their sleek vessels weaving through the chaos like predators regaining focus. "They're learning," he murmured, "but they're still chasing us on instinct." Quinn stepped forward, his datapad clutched tightly. "We need to stay ahead of them, Captain. If they manage to box us in—" "They won't," Orion interrupted. His voice held no uncertainty. "We don't play their game. We rewrite the rules." The faint vibration of the ship's rapid maneuvers coursed through the floor, each shift a subtle reminder of how precarious their position was. The distant crackle of an overloaded circuit punctuated the tension, a grim counterpoint to the focused silence of the crew. "Status on those disabled ships?" Orion asked, his eyes narrowing at the tactical map. "Still adrift," Drayden replied. "Their systems are failing, but life support is holding." "They'll call reinforcements," Quinn said, his tone urgent. "If we wait too long—" "We're not waiting," Orion snapped. He gestured toward the display where the Harbinger formation was tightening. "We baited them into chaos. Now we force them into collapse." Sarn looked up from his station, his expression cautious. "Sir, if we push too hard, we risk exposing our position to the rest of their fleet." Orion met Sarn's gaze, his tone cold but steady. "If we don't push, they regroup, and we lose the only edge we've got. I'll take the risk." The bridge crew moved with practiced precision as Orion outlined the next step. The ironclad veered again, slipping between jagged fragments of debris that glinted like broken mirrors against the darkness. The Harbinger ships pursued, their movements fluid but deliberate, like wolves circling prey. "Deploy scatter mines," Orion ordered. "Target their approach vectors." Drayden nodded, activating the release. A series of spherical devices launched into the void, each one armed to detonate on proximity. On the display, the mines glowed faintly as they drifted into position. "They're closing," Sarn reported. "First ship entering the minefield." Orion leaned forward, his focus razor-sharp. "Wait for it." The tension on the bridge was suffocating, the air heavy with anticipation. Then a burst of light erupted on the display as the lead Harbinger ship struck a mine. Its sleek hull twisted, fragments spiraling outward in a violent cascade. "Direct hit," Drayden confirmed. "They're pulling back to regroup." "Not far enough," Orion said. His voice was like a blade cutting through hesitation. "Press forward. Show them we don't run." The ironclad surged ahead. Its crew braced for the next encounter. Outside, the debris field churned with the remnants of their trap, and the Harbingers circled like vultures. Orion's thoughts darkened as he stared into the chaos. If this was the edge of their strength, what horrors lay at the center? The bridge of the ironclad was bathed in the soft glow of tactical displays, the faint whir of ventilation systems threading through the tense silence. Outside, the void churned with the debris of the Harbingers' retreating ships, their predatory elegance marred by jagged edges and drifting wreckage. Orion stood near the viewport, his eyes fixed on the chaotic tableau as his crew worked with mechanical precision. "Drayden, status report," Orion commanded, his tone steady but unyielding. Drayden's fingers danced across the console. "Harbinger fleet is regrouping 2 clicks out. Smaller vessels are reinforcing their flanks, but they're holding formation. They're cautious." Orion smirked, the faint curve of his lips more predator than commander. "Caution won't save them if we don't give them time to think." Quinn, standing at Orion's shoulder, spoke in a low voice. "Captain, we've pushed them into disorder, but they're adapting faster than expected. We need to understand their strategy before we make another move." Orion turned, his gaze sharp. "Their strategy is fear. They rely on intimidation, overwhelming strength. We've proven they bleed. That's the only strategy we need right now." The comms crackled, and Sarn's voice broke the tension. "Captain, we're picking up a transmission." "From the Harbingers?" Orion asked, his focus snapping to the console. "No," Sarn replied, his brow furrowing. "It's Helorian, a distress signal, faint but persistent." Origin point matches a sector further into their territory. Quinn frowned, his expression darkening. Another trap? Or survivors, Orion countered. He moved to the tactical display, the sector highlighted like a single candle in an endless night. What's the signal saying? Sarn adjusted the feed, the static-laced words translating onto the screen. Coordinates. Critical data. Harbinger. He paused, his face tightening. It's a warning, sir. They're transmitting information about the Harbingers. Orion's jaw tightened, his thoughts churning. If they're alive, they'll be surrounded. The Harbingers won't let anyone escape with intel. Do we pursue? Quinn asked, his tone cautious. They'll expect us to follow. Orion stared at the display, the weight of the decision pressing on him like a vice. Sarn, can you pinpoint their fleet's focus? Sarn nodded, his hands moving swiftly. They're spreading their forces, Captain. Most of their heavier ships are positioned between us and that signal. They're baiting us, Drayden said, his voice grim. They know we'll go for it. Let them think it's working, Orion replied, his voice like tempered steel. Set course for the signal, but divert half our drones. I want them targeting the Harbinger formation, drawing their fire. Quinn hesitated. That's a gamble, Captain. It's a risk, Orion corrected, his tone cold. And it's the only way we're getting answers. The ironclad shifted course, the tension on the bridge palpable as the crew prepared for the next move. The Harbinger fleet loomed ahead, their dark forms like specters against the void. Orion's gaze didn't waver. They wanted a hunt. Now they're going to see what it's like to be the prey. The ironclad cut through the void like a blade, its path veering toward the faint Helorian distress signal. The bridge buzzed with quiet tension, each officer locked in their duties. The tactical display flickered with hostile markers, Harbinger ships circling like vultures. Orion Vex leaned against the command console, his gaze fixed on the faint pulse of the distress beacon, its rhythm steady, yet haunting. Distance to signal? He asked, his voice calm despite the crackling energy in the air. 6 clicks, Sarn replied without looking up. Harbinger ships closing in. They've picked up on our course adjustment. Let them, Orion said, his lips a taut line. Drayden, status on the decoy drones? Deployed and engaging, Drayden responded. They're drawing fire, but the Harbingers are recalibrating. They'll adapt soon. The deck trembled faintly as the ironclad accelerated, threading its way through the chaotic wreckage of the previous battle. Outside, fragments of ruined ships drifted like specters, glinting faintly as they tumbled through the emptiness. The air inside the ship felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm, a sharp, almost electric tension. They're funneling us, Quinn said, his brow furrowed as he analyzed the enemy formation, forcing us into a tighter approach. Orion didn't flinch. They want us pinned, but they're underestimating us. Keep our movements erratic. Use the debris for cover. Drayden, ready the plasma ejectors. We'll cut a hole through them if we have to. The crew moved with silent efficiency, the soft clatter of controls and the occasional murmur of confirmation the only sounds. The tactical display lit up as the Harbingers adjusted their formation, their ships closing ranks into a wall of sleek, angular death. They've blocked the direct path, Sarn announced, his voice tense. They're closing in fast. Orion's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. They're overcommitting. They think we're desperate. He straightened, his voice sharp. Drayden, ignite the plasma field ahead. Force them to adjust. Drayden executed the order without hesitation, and the ironclad fired a concentrated plasma burst into the wreckage field. The void erupted in a cascade of blinding light and molten fragments, the wave of energy sending shockwaves rippling outward. The Harbinger formation wavered, their ships pulling back momentarily to regroup. They're splitting, Sarn said, a hint of triumph in his tone. Good, Orion replied. Keep us on course to the signal. Use the opening. As the ironclad surged forward, the distress beacon's source came into view. A battered Helorian transport nestled within a dense asteroid cluster. Its hull was pockmarked with burns, its once elegant design marred by jagged scars. Faint lights flickered across its surface, a fragile pulse of life amidst the darkness. "Captain," Quinn said, his voice low, "that ship shouldn't be functional." "Then someone wanted it to stay that way," Orion muttered. His eyes narrowed, a chill running down his spine. "Drayden, prepare for boarding. If there's something they don't want us to find, we're taking it." The ironclad crept closer, its hull brushing past asteroid fragments as the crew braced for whatever secrets the Helorian vessel held. Orion's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary rescue mission. The Harbingers weren't just protecting their prey, they were hiding something far worse. The docking clamps of the ironclad hissed as they latched onto the battered Helorian transport. Its hull groaned under the pressure, faint bursts of escaping vapor curling into the void like ghostly tendrils. Orion Vex stood in the airlock, his gloved hand resting on the cold steel of the release lever. Behind him, the boarding team waited in tense silence, their boots clinking softly against the deck. "Status on their life support?" Orion asked, his voice low but firm. Drayden's voice crackled through the comm. "Barely holding. Atmosphere's thin but breathable. Scans show minimal life signs, 2 at most." "2?" Orion murmured, his eyes narrowing. "This ship could carry 100. "It's a tomb," Quinn muttered from behind him, "and it's waiting for its final grave." Orion glanced back at Quinn, his gaze sharp. "Not yet. We're not done with it." The airlock door slid open with a mechanical whine, revealing the dim interior of the transport. The stench of scorched metal hit them first, sharp and bitter, undercut by a faint tang of decay. Orion stepped inside, his boots landing on a deck coated with ash and fragments of broken panels. The air was heavy, tinged with a metallic bite that stung the back of his throat. "Eyes up," Orion ordered, his voice slicing through the stillness. "Stay sharp. We're not alone." The corridor stretched ahead, dim emergency lights flickering sporadically. Shadows danced across the walls, their jagged movements making the space feel alive. Orion's footsteps echoed, mingling with the faint hum of failing systems. Quinn's voice was barely a whisper. "This ship's been gutted. No crew, no defenses. Why would the Harbingers leave it intact?" Orion stopped, his gaze scanning the fractured walls. "Because they weren't finished with it." As they moved deeper into the ship, the faint sound of labored breathing reached their ears. It was uneven, rasping, like wind struggling through a narrow crevice. Orion raised a fist, signaling the team to stop. His pulse quickened, the eerie sound gnawing at his instincts. "In here," he said, pointing to a partially open hatch. He stepped forward, the door scraping as he forced it wider. The chamber beyond was dimly lit, its center dominated by a lone Helorian figure slumped against a console. His skin, once vibrant and smooth, was mottled and cracked, glowing faintly in the low light. Wires snaked around his arms and chest, connected to a data module, blinking weakly. "Captain," Quinn said, his voice wavering, "that's not natural." The Helorian's head jerked up, his black eyes locking onto Orion. His voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible. "You shouldn't have come." Orion crouched beside him, his tone firm. "We received your distress signal. What are the Harbingers hiding?" The Helorian coughed violently, flecks of dark fluid staining his lips. "It's too late. They don't just conquer, they rewrite." "Rewrite?" Orion repeated, his voice hardening. "What does that mean?" The Helorian's hand trembled as he reached for the data module, his fingers curling weakly around it. "Take it. Learn. Before they change everything." The module disconnected with a sharp hiss, its faint glow pulsing in Orion's hand. He glanced at Quinn, then back at the dying Helorian. "Seal this area," Orion ordered. "We've got what we came for." But as the team retreated toward the airlock, a new sound echoed through the transport, metallic scraping, growing louder, closer. Orion's grip tightened on the module as he turned toward the source. Whatever the Harbingers had left behind wasn't just a warning. It was still alive. The scraping noise grew louder, an eerie rhythm that seemed to echo from every shadowed corner of the Helorian transport. Orion's instincts screamed, but his focus remained razor-sharp. His team's breathing was steady but shallow, their weapons raised and ready as the sound reverberated through the damaged corridors. "Quinn, seal the airlock behind us," Orion commanded, his voice cutting through the oppressive tension. Quinn's fingers moved quickly across the console, his eyes darting between the hatch and the corridor. "Sealing now. Whatever's in here isn't getting out." A metallic screech tore through the quiet, closer this time. The floor vibrated faintly, the sound like claws raking across steel. Orion motioned for the team to tighten their formation, his gloved hand gripping the data module as if it held answers to the growing nightmare. Drayden's voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, we're picking up movement on internal sensors. Multiple signatures converging on your location." "How many?" Orion asked, his tone low and clipped. "Too many," Drayden replied grimly. "It's not just one or two. They're swarming." The team moved swiftly, boots clanging against the warped deck plating as they pushed toward the airlock. The faint stench of decay lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of scorched circuitry. Orion's jaw clenched as the transport groaned under the strain of its failing systems. "Eyes on every corner," he ordered, his voice steady. "They're trying to hurt us." Another screech rang out, this time followed by a guttural, inhuman growl. Shadows shifted at the edge of their vision, fleeting and unnatural. Orion raised his weapon, the soft buzz of its power cell charging, breaking the silence. His team mirrored his movements, their rifles trained on the dim corridors ahead. "What in the stars is that?" Sarn muttered, his voice barely audible. "Not something we're stopping to find out," Orion snapped. "Move faster." As they approached the airlock, the scraping sounds intensified, a cacophony that filled the narrow space like a rising tide. Orion's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay focused. The airlock door came into view, its emergency lights flickering erratically. "Drayden, get that door open!" Orion barked into the comms. "Working on it," Drayden replied, his voice tense. "The transport systems are resisting, like they're alive." Another growl echoed, this one louder, closer, accompanied by the unmistakable clang of something heavy striking the deck. Quinn turned, his face pale. "Captain, they're behind us." Orion spun, his weapon trained on the corridor they just left. A shadow darted into view, long and segmented, its movements unnatural. The thing clung to the walls, its limbs scraping against the metal as it twisted toward them. "Fire!" Orion ordered. The corridor lit up with bursts of energy fire, the impacts sparking off the creature's sleek, chitinous form. It recoiled, a piercing shriek tearing through the air, but more shadows emerged behind it, their movements jagged and relentless. "Drayden, now!" Orion shouted. The airlock hissed open, revealing the safety of the ironclad. Orion pushed his team through, his weapon firing in controlled bursts to hold back the swarm. As the last of his crew crossed the threshold, he turned, his eyes locking onto the approaching creatures. Their forms were grotesque, a fusion of organic and mechanical, their glowing eyes filled with a malevolent intelligence. He stepped back into the airlock, slamming his fist against the emergency release. The door groaned shut as the creatures lunged, their claws scraping against the thick metal. Orion exhaled sharply, his grip tightening around the data module. "Get us out of here," he said, his voice hard as steel. "And prepare for decontamination. Whatever they left behind, we're not letting it spread." The ironclad surged away from the Helorian transport, its shields absorbing the residual energy waves from the blast doors sealing shut. Orion Vex stood on the bridge, his jaw taut, his mind already calculating the next steps. The data module sat on the central console, pulsing faintly, its glow a haunting reminder of the horrors left behind. "Status?" Orion barked. "Clean separation," Drayden replied, his voice clipped. "But the Harbingers won't be far behind. Their ships are repositioning." "Helorian vessel?" Orion asked, not looking up from the tactical display. Sarn's voice was tense. "It's gone. The internal systems triggered a self-destruct. Whatever they left in there, they didn't want it escaping." Orion's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping the edge of the console. "That wasn't self-preservation. That was control. They wanted us to see just enough." Quinn leaned forward, his face pale but resolute. "We have the module. If it's what the Helorians said, it could expose the Harbinger's entire strategy." Or it's bait, Drayden interjected. A trap to force us into their hands. Orion nodded, his mind racing. Both are possible, but we can't ignore the risk. If the data gives us a way to counter them, it's worth the gamble. He straightened, his voice taking on a commanding edge. Drayden, deploy scout drones to monitor the Harbinger fleet's movements. I want real-time updates on their positioning. Drayden nodded, his hands moving swiftly over the controls. Drones launched. They're deploying across the sector. Sarn, analyze the module, Orion continued. Quinn, assist. Focus on the encryption layers and any structural anomalies. If there's a payload hidden in there, I want to know before it bites us. The two officers exchanged a glance before nodding. Sarn carried the module to the science bay, its faint light reflecting off the walls as he disappeared through the bulkhead. What's the plan, Captain? Drayden asked, his tone cautious. We draw them into a confined zone, Orion said, his gaze fixed on the star map. Something with enough natural hazards to offset their technological advantage. If we can isolate their ships, we'll use their arrogance against them. Drayden raised an eyebrow. Natural hazards? This sector isn't exactly known for its dangers. Not yet, Orion replied, his lips tightening into a grim line. But it will be. Sarn, pull environmental data from the nearest debris fields, anything with unstable gravity wells or high radiation zones. Over the comm, Sarn's voice came through. There's a fragmented asteroid belt 2 sectors over. Gravity spikes are sporadic but volatile. If we detonate a small charge at the right location, we could create a cascading field. Orion nodded, the pieces falling into place. Good. Position our fleet at the edge of the belt. We'll lure the Harbingers in, trigger the collapse, and force them to scatter. Their coordination won't hold in that kind of chaos. Quinn returned to the bridge, his voice urgent. Captain, the module's data suggests they're not just hunting. They're harvesting. They don't conquer for territory. They conquer for raw biological material. Orion's face darkened. Then we make sure they don't get what they're looking for. Set course for the asteroid belt. Let's show them what Deathworlders can do when the terrain is on our side. The asteroid belt loomed on the ironclad's tactical display, a sprawling graveyard of fractured rock and debris orbiting an unstable star. Each asteroid spun erratically, their jagged edges catching the faint light and reflecting it like shards of broken mirrors. The ship slowed as it approached, maneuvering carefully into position at the edge of the chaos. Gravity wells are active, Sarn reported, his voice steady despite the tension thickening in the air. Localized spikes across multiple sectors. If we detonate strategically, the entire belt could destabilize. Orion Vex stood at the center of the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back. His gaze swept across the display, taking in every detail. Map the weakest points. I want charges set on those asteroids, enough to trigger a chain reaction without obliterating us in the process. Drayden nodded from his station. Detonation teams are prepping the payloads. It'll take precision to pull this off. It always does, Orion replied, his tone sharp but calm. He turned to Quinn. Status on the Harbingers? They're closing in, Quinn said, his fingers gliding across his terminal. Formations tighter than before. They're not scattering this time, they've learned. Then we give them a lesson they won't forget, Orion said. Position our fleet along the belt's outer rim. Use the debris for cover and keep power output low. We'll look like part of the wreckage until we strike. The ironclad shifted into place, its dark hull blending seamlessly with the asteroid field. Smaller escort ships followed, their movements precise as they nestled into the shadowed craters of nearby debris. The crew worked in tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Payloads ready, Drayden reported. Charges are primed and synced to remote detonation. Orion nodded, his focus unshaken. Hold until my mark. We need them fully committed before we light the fuse. Outside, the Harbinger fleet emerged, their sleek ships cutting through the void like predators on the hunt. Their formation was tighter than before, their movements deliberate and synchronized. They advanced toward the belt, their scanning pulses sweeping across the debris. They're searching for us, Sarn said, his voice barely above a whisper. Let them look, Orion replied, his gaze fixed on the display. The closer they get, the better. The Harbinger ships drifted deeper into the belt, their hulls reflecting the faint glow of the unstable star. As they neared the planted charges, Orion raised a hand, his voice steady but edged with command. "All ships, hold position. Drayden, prepare to ignite." Drayden's fingers hovered over the controls, his eyes locked on the screen. The Harbingers moved closer, their sensors pinging the belt with increasing frequency. The tension on the bridge was suffocating, each second stretching into an eternity. "Now," Orion said, his voice slicing through the stillness. Drayden activated the charges, and the asteroid belt erupted. Massive rocks splintered and spun outward, gravity wells collapsing into chaos. The Harbinger ships faltered, their formation disintegrating as they struggled to adapt to the sudden, violent shifts. "Open fire!" Orion commanded. The ironclad and its fleet sprang to life, their weapons blazing as they tore into the disoriented Harbingers. Amid the chaos, Orion's voice rang out, steady and unyielding. "Keep pressing. Show them what happens when they underestimate us." The asteroid field was a maelstrom of chaos. Fractured rocks spiraled through space, colliding with deafening force as the Harbinger fleet scrambled to regain control. Orion Vex stood resolute at the ironclad's command station, his eyes narrowing as his fleet exploited every moment of disarray. Beams of energy lanced through the debris, striking vulnerable enemy vessels. Harbinger ships faltered, their sleek precision unraveling under the assault. Quinn returned to the bridge, his voice urgent. "Captain, the module's data suggests they're not just hunting, they're harvesting. They don't conquer for territory. They conquer for raw biological material." Orion's face darkened. "Then we make sure they don't get what they're looking for. Set course for the asteroid belt. Let's show them what Deathworlders can do when the terrain is on our side." The asteroid belt loomed on the ironclad's tactical display, a sprawling graveyard of fractured rock and debris orbiting an unstable star. Each asteroid spun erratically, their jagged edges catching the faint light and reflecting it like shards of broken mirrors. The ship slowed as it approached, maneuvering carefully into position at the edge of the chaos. "Gravity wells are active," Sarn reported, his voice steady despite the tension thickening in the air. "Localized spikes across multiple sectors. If we detonate strategically, the entire belt could destabilize." Orion Vex stood at the center of the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back. His gaze swept across the display, taking in every detail. "Map the weakest points. I want charges set on those asteroids, enough to trigger a chain reaction without obliterating us in the process." Drayden nodded from his station. "Detonation teams are prepping the payloads. It'll take precision to pull this off." "It always does," Orion replied, his tone sharp but calm. He turned to Quinn. "Status on the Harbingers?" "They're closing in," Quinn said, his fingers gliding across his terminal. "Formations tighter than before. They're not scattering this time, they've learned." "Then we give them a lesson they won't forget," Orion said. "Position our fleet along the belt's outer rim. Use the debris for cover and keep power output low. We'll look like part of the wreckage until we strike." The ironclad shifted into place, its dark hull blending seamlessly with the asteroid field. Smaller escort ships followed, their movements precise as they nestled into the shadowed craters of nearby debris. The crew worked in tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. "Payloads ready," Drayden reported. "Charges are primed and synced to remote detonation." Orion nodded, his focus unshaken. "Hold until my mark. We need them fully committed before we light the fuse." Outside, the Harbinger fleet emerged, their sleek ships cutting through the void like predators on the hunt. Their formation was tighter than before, their movements deliberate and synchronized. They advanced toward the belt, their scanning pulses sweeping across the debris. "They're searching for us," Sarn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let them look," Orion replied, his gaze fixed on the display. "The closer they get, the better." The Harbinger ships drifted deeper into the belt, their hulls reflecting the faint glow of the unstable star. As they neared the planted charges, Orion raised a hand, his voice steady but edged with command. "All ships, hold position. Drayden, prepare to ignite." Drayden's fingers hovered over the controls, his eyes locked on the screen. The Harbingers moved closer, their sensors pinging the belt with increasing frequency. The tension on the bridge was suffocating, each second stretching into an eternity. "Now," Orion said, his voice slicing through the stillness. Drayden activated the charges, and the asteroid belt erupted. Massive rocks splintered and spun outward, gravity wells collapsing into chaos. The Harbinger ships faltered, their formation disintegrating as they struggled to adapt to the sudden, violent shifts. "Open fire!" Orion commanded. The ironclad and its fleet sprang to life, their weapons blazing as they tore into the disoriented Harbingers. Amid the chaos, Orion's voice rang out, steady and unyielding. "Keep pressing. Show them what happens when they underestimate us." The asteroid field was a maelstrom of chaos. Fractured rocks spiraled through space, colliding with deafening force as the Harbinger fleet scrambled to regain control. Orion Vex stood resolute at the ironclad's command station, his eyes narrowing as his fleet exploited every moment of disarray. Beams of energy lanced through the debris, striking vulnerable enemy vessels. Harbinger ships faltered, their sleek precision unraveling under the assault. "Captain, the lead Harbinger ship is falling back," Sarn reported, his voice tight with urgency. "Their command structure is fracturing." "Good," Orion said, his tone colder than the vacuum beyond. "They built their power on fear and control. Take that away, and they're nothing but hollow metal and empty pride." Drayden's voice crackled through the comms. "Another volley ready, targeting their remaining flanks." "Fire," Orion commanded without hesitation. The ironclad shuddered as its weaponry unleashed another wave of destruction, cutting through the weakened Harbinger defenses. Explosions bloomed across the void, casting fleeting shadows over the asteroid field. Quinn's voice was hushed but sharp. "They're breaking. They don't know how to fight in this chaos." "They never had to," Orion replied, his voice like tempered steel. "Their enemies always bent, always broke, not today." As another Harbinger ship fractured under the weight of the assault, Orion's gaze shifted to the central display. A massive vessel loomed on the periphery of the chaos, their flagship, larger and darker than the others, its hull gleaming ominously. It didn't retreat, it waited. "Drayden, status on the flagship," Orion said, his voice steady but edged with caution. Drayden hesitated. "Their systems are fully intact. They're not moving. Yet." "They're watching," Orion said, his eyes narrowing. "They're calculating whether we're worth the risk." Quinn stepped closer, his expression grim. "And if they decide we are?" Orion's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Then we show them why they should have stayed in the shadows." The flagship stirred, its engines igniting with a sudden burst of light that made the deck seem to tremble beneath their feet. It began to advance, slow and deliberate, cutting through the field like an ancient predator wading into a hunting ground. "Captain," Sarn said, his voice tight, "they're charging something. Energy output is off the charts." "They're making their move," Orion said. He straightened, his voice rising, each word razor-sharp. "All ships hold your ground. We've come too far to give them an inch." The Harbinger flagship unleashed its weapon, a blinding beam that cut through the debris field like a scythe. Smaller ships disintegrated in its wake, the force of the blast rippling through space. Orion's voice was a growl. "Drayden, launch the destabilizers. We didn't come here to run." The ironclad fired its final gambit. Gravitic disruptors detonated in unison, creating a cascading wave that tore through the flagship's shields. Its once impenetrable hull began to crack, light pouring from the fractures like blood from a wound. Orion leaned forward, his voice calm but fierce. "This is what Deathworlders do. We don't conquer. We don't flee. We fight, and we protect those who can't." The flagship shuddered violently, its power systems collapsing as the final blow landed. It exploded in a blinding inferno, and when the light faded, only silence remained. Orion turned to his crew, his voice low but firm. "Today, the galaxy knows what we are, and they'll never forget." The debris field was eerily silent in the aftermath of the Harbinger flagship's destruction. The scattered remnants of its once imposing form floated lifelessly, drifting against the faint glow of the distant star. The ironclad held its position, scarred but intact, its crew basking in the quiet victory that had eluded so many others before them. Orion Vex stood at the center of the bridge, his gaze locked on the tactical display. The surviving Harbinger ships were retreating, their once coordinated movements now a chaotic scramble for safety. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Status report," he said, his voice steady, though it carried a subtle edge of exhaustion. Sarn's response came quickly. "Harbinger fleet is in full retreat, Captain. No sign of regrouping. They've abandoned the sector." "Good," Orion replied, his tone cold but resolute. "Let them run. They'll think twice before challenging us again." Drayden turned from his console, a rare glint of satisfaction in his eyes. The galaxy just witnessed something it's never seen. We didn't just survive. They did. Quinn stepped closer, his expression pensive. "And the message we've sent is loud enough to echo across the stars." Orion nodded, his jaw tightening. "We weren't just fighting for Earth. This was for every species they've preyed on. They built their empire on fear. Today, we shattered it." The bridge fell silent for a moment, the magnitude of their achievement settling over the crew like a palpable force. Outside the viewport, the remains of the asteroid field slowly began to stabilize, the chaos fading into quiet stillness. Yet, Orion's mind raced with what lay ahead. "Captain," Quinn said, his voice soft but firm, "the data module. There's more in it than we thought." Orion turned to face him, his expression darkening. "Explain." Quinn tapped on his datapad, the display on the central console shifting to reveal layers of encrypted files. This wasn't just about harvesting. The Harbingers were engineering something. Hybrid forms. They weren't just taking. They were creating. The words hit the room like a blow, the crew exchanging uneasy glances. Orion's jaw set, his mind already leaping ahead. "Then they're not finished. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning." Drayden's voice cut through the silence. "What's the plan, Captain?" Orion stepped toward the viewport, his reflection ghosted against the void beyond. His voice, when it came, was low but unyielding. "We prepare, we rebuild, and when they come back, and they will, they won't find prey. They'll find protectors." He turned to his crew, his gaze sweeping across the bridge. "This isn't just about survival. It's about making sure no one suffers under them again. Earth's history is written in struggle. We've earned our place in the stars, not as conquerors, but as defenders." The ironclad shifted course, its engines flaring as it began the long journey home. Behind it, the fractured remnants of the battle faded into the distance. Orion's voice carried through the comms, steady and fierce. "Humanity's legacy begins here. The galaxy will remember this day not because we fought, but because we chose to stand."